Hello, I am here today with Todd Brekhus, the Chief Product Officer of Renaissance Learning. Todd has been in the industry for a while and has seen a lot of the evolutions, has lived through a couple of, I think, sort of sea changes and how we think about education content, education technology, all the different aspects of what goes on in the classroom. And I'm excited to learn from him today. Todd, just to start us off, would you mind just talking about your sort of career narrative and how you ended up where you are today? Like, how intentional was it? How
Sure.
Forrest Gumpian was it? I'd love to hear it straight from you.
Well, thank you, Matt. It's great to be on today, and it was great to meet you at ASU GSV, and it's a fun follow up here. I really like this format, so it's fun. Yeah, so I began my career kind of I'm going to say when I was 14 years old, believe it or not. But, I was the kid in the neighborhood who had the first computer, and my best friend's mom
Amazing.
was the head of library in the Bloomington Public Schools in
Huh.
Minnesota, the Twin Cities. And I got a call and said, "We need a teacher for the summer school, and you're the only kid we know with Apple II computers." So that's where my career actually got started. I never thought I would be an educator or in education, but honestly, it was the career trajectory that pushed it this direction. And I brought a bunch of seventh graders, I was like 4 years older than them at the time, into learning about what PCs were and technology was. And that was my beginning. And full circle, I came back from graduating undergrad in Concordia, Moorhead, Minnesota, and spent my time in technology, but I was building more for the university side of things. And then landed a teaching job in suburban Maryland where my parents moved, and spent 8 years there at a school called Severn School in Severna Park, Maryland, and had a great opportunity to, believe it or not, teach the president of MCI's kids at the time, and also meet Vint Cerf, the creator of the internet. And from there, I actually took a job at MCI and built out their education programs. Education MCI was the company, and that I was at that time the director of. And even though I knew very little, and I was in my early 30s, and I went for it. I was going to grad school at Johns Hopkins at the time in Baltimore, and then I went to MCI and literally started an EdTech vertical within a very, very large multi-billion-dollar company that actually did create the internet and did build the backbone of the internet. So I learned a lot. My first product there was actually building out a teacher training program called Marco Polo, which launched nationwide and went to all the states. We gave state grants, but it was a culmination of websites like National Geographic. We built their first education website. Our aim was to build the Good Housekeeping seal of approval for education websites. And so we partnered with Smithsonian and the National Endowment for Humanities and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And we built standards-based resources against these websites, organized them together in a portal, and then taught teachers how to use the internet, which seems funny now. And it's kind of AI-ish because
I was going to say there's some parallels
yeah,
here.
there's some parallels. Like, we need to use the internet. Like today, we're saying we need to use AI. And at that time, no one really understood the internet. You remember the Katie Couric piece on Today's Show? This is circa 1999. So
Yeah.
I know I'm, but the world was a very different place, and the internet was unknown, and we brought that to educators. And I really think there's some parallels to today's world. But fast forward, I left MCI, did a startup, and I built a phonics-based literacy program in technology, built and sold that within 16 months to Plato Learning, which is now Edmentum.
Sure.
Stayed at Edmentum for 4 years as their head of product and head of marketing, and built the SaaS version of the Plato system there in the online Edmentum structure. Left that and built a next startup within Capstone Publishers. I built Myon, which is the online digital reading program. We then sold that to Francisco Partners, our first private equity venture, and then turned around and sold that to Renaissance Learning. And so full circle, Francisco then bought Renaissance, and a little bit of the rest is history. And now we're on the career trajectory of focused on Renaissance and building out our ecosystem of products from just Star and Accelerated Reader all the way to about the 13 products we've added through acquisitions, including the Myon acquisition that I was the founder of. Fast forward all the way through Illuminate and Nearpod and Freckle, and gosh, I'm missing several of them. Our most recent acquisition was GL Education out of the UK, building out our vertical international profile. That was a
I love that.
long version of of an update on my career, but it's been amazing. And I'd say the focus has been always on teachers, always on education, and always on thinking about what transforms the teaching and learning experience with technology. And in the old days, it was all about, we need more technology, we need more computers. Then we had the pandemic, and now it's about how do we really use AI effectively, and how do we think about this data-driven world of education that we're upon.
I love that. And I think there is something to, a lot of the things that we take away from our first couple of jobs, end up echoing long into
That's
our
cool.
career. I relate to your first job. My first job was, I grew up. My father taught skiing at Wildcat Mountain in New Hampshire. Every
I was a
year,
ski racer, Matt, so that was my high
yeah,
school sport, so I love it.
yeah. Well, and every year Wildcat, before Vail came in and started buying up all the mountains, Wildcat had this problem where they would hire a bunch of teenage snowboard instructors every November, and they would all quit by, February vacation. So when I was 12, before I was legally allowed to work, Wildcat desperately needed some snowboard instructors. And so they hired me and paid me in cash. And the only rule was I had to keep my goggles on, because then people couldn't tell how old I was.
That's
So
smart.
it was very much a patient of opportunity. It sounds like, in a similar way to you with the Apple II computers.
Yeah, the one quick story on that, back when I was 14 years old, is the administrators came down and said, "Well, you need to unbox all these computers and you need to set them up and you need to get them ready." And I'm like, "No, I'm going to make the kids do that. That's part of the fun."
That's
So
part of the learning.
literally, we took the carts and I had these 12-year-olds, I'm like 14, 15 years old, loading up the carts and plugging in the ribbon cables and doing all this work. So it was my first foray into project-based learning and thinking about the real-world application of education. It was when I was young. It was fun.
I love that. And it sounds like it was fairly intuitive to you. It's
It
not
was.
something that you're like, oh, this
It was.
is XYZ. It's not, this is how I would do it. This is why it's fun.
Yeah, I didn't read
So
any Bloom's taxonomy as a teen. Not that geeky.
and I'd love to dig into the parallels between the internet and AI, right? And the joke that always comes to mind for me is there was a movie called The Interns,
Yeah.
where I think it was Vince
Google
Vaughn and
intern.
Matthew McConaughey were talking about on the line. But it is like,
I
it's
thought you
a
were going to bring up the
tool.
sleeping pods. That wasn't that the same
Those
movie?
two, yes, yes. But I think this concept of, like, instead of thinking of it as a big scary thing or whatever, it's
Hmm.
a tool. Like,
Right.
the internet in some ways did reshape teaching, but in a lot of ways it's still the same. And I sort of expect the same from AI. And so I guess, like, do you have any takeaways from that bridge between when teachers were afraid of the internet to the internet as a part of our life, right? We use the internet to communicate with parents, to communicate with
Yeah.
principals, to communicate with students. Are there any sort of interesting takeaways that come to mind for you?
There's a number. I think the main one that I'm thinking about is a lot of the early internet training was, this is a browser. This is the back button. This is forward. And that sounds so funny now when you think about it.
Yeah.
Now, like, it is so native. But
So, like,
hyper.
this is an LLM. This is a prompt. This
Right,
is
right.
a,
Yeah, and I think we start with these nuts and bolts things, and this is actually Bloom's taxonomy. It's like we get to this base level of information and recall, and then to really apply it and to really put it into perspective. What I needed back then, and I partnered with somebody at Yale who built these model lessons that would take and show you how the internet could really transform your classroom. And I remember one of the lessons was, we went to the archives, and in the archives they had these maps, the National Archives, the maps, and it was basically a version of a map, one of the very first real good internet apps inside of just a regular browser, and you could zoom in on an old picture and go
yeah.
see that map in live, and then you could go to a MapQuest at the time and see where that location was. And that lesson was around, like, what happens when you zoom out and zoom in, and it was probably about a fifth grade geography lesson. But the context of the knowing the tool, you didn't really have to teach the tool of the browse and the find, and maybe you had to, in the beginning you had to do a little bit of the basics, but it was more about, what does this change that we haven't been able to do in the classroom, and how you might have had to go find a transparency, go copy that in a copier, then make the transparency, put it up on the transparency, overlay it with this, do this. And now all of a sudden you've got two live things in front of you that you could either demonstrate from the class level, or at that time students didn't have the access necessarily right away, but the transformation of the lesson, the content, the pedagogy, and the instructional design of what can change if you have the right tool. And so my parallel with this is with AI. I think, and we'll get to the Renaissance story, I'm sure, in a little bit, but the idea of really bringing data in that I know my students before I teach a lesson, or I can experience the AI through a lesson and automate that lesson in a few ways that haven't been possibly before, is a much deeper, richer experience for the educator. And I think they do get it. And they have, obviously, we've advanced in terms of the clicks and the finds and the research. But I say the faster we put the experience and the understanding in the actual pedagogy and the instructional design, and we see that transformation, and we do something that we've had difficulty doing in the past. And I think the production, whether it's LLMs or agentic AI, or whether it's the concept of connecting ideas that have been disparate before and haven't been found, and obviously that we could get into what we can do with kids and what we can do with students, but I think the power of AI, I think, is very similar to the browser situation we were in 25 years ago.
Yeah. Well, and I think what's sort of interesting and frustrating to me is like you have these like, big fancy names talking about how cool AI is. And it seems like they're doing all sorts of amazing things with AI. And like
I mean,
probably
Even Sam Altman, as he's describing agentic AI, is describing an algebra course being taught by the student, right? Like this new technology is going to just teach algebra for you on its own without a teacher. And that was actually the browser situation. Oh my gosh, we're going to turn teaching over to the browser, and it's going to be, you're somehow going to get enveloped, and you're not going to be able to have the human touch connection, personalized piece of teaching and learning. So that frustration, I think,
well, and it's they sort of jump to something that's unrelatable, right?
that's
So it's
right.
like I'm reasonably conversant in AI for a non-technical person. And I'm like, I don't know, man, it's still pretty hard to like build a basic app,
It
right?
is. Yeah.
And so there's this like what's being said versus like what is accessible. And then underneath that too, there's this element of like, are you trying to be a consumer of AI or are you trying to be a creator of AI enabled things?
Right. Right.
I think like so there's multiple levels to this, right?
Right.
And I think to get into a little bit of what Renaissance is doing versus what I see in the market,
Hmm.
I think what I see in the venture funding announcements is a lot of like trying to enable AI, giving people tools to create AI, which
Yep.
is fine and necessary on some level.
Mhm.
But what I see from you is trying to help teachers and students via
Yeah.
teachers be
Yeah.
consumers of AI. And to me that feels a little bit more approachable. Maybe I don't know
Yeah. No,
if you could
let
talk
me
about that.
let me
Yeah.
speak to the production side of it, because I think there's internal needs for us as companies, especially content creators, to use internal tools and AI. And our whole company is transforming with AI. We're flipping our engineering model on its head. We're really focused on the AI engineer even and supporting that
Sure.
and building in the UAT and the testing and the quality assurance. And it's phenomenal for some of the code connections and the speed of code, the creation of instructional content, the building of standard lessons and activities. We're all in on that on our side. We're never going to do it without editors. We're never going to do that without key
Yeah.
programmers that are examining and working. I say never. I mean, but
Not in the
near future,
reasonable
in
future.
my
Yeah.
retirement zone, like we're going to be heavily human in the loop kind of
Sure.
AI work. But the low level parts you talked about, like, hey, we can create a lesson plan. This will build us an automated communication path. I can write a letter to the home. I can edit the activity. Those are fine, and I think they're maybe going to help save some teachers some time. I think some of the apps that are out there today definitely do that. I do worry about the quality. I worry about what's backing the LLM. I mean, we all know what the LLM was trained on. It was trained on our browsing history. I mean, let's get real here. Like there wasn't just a fine organized path of just academics. My example of MCI and my work at Marco Polo was this was only the top tier content and standard setting providers delivering that. And granted, that needed to escape the ivory tower world and get to localized content for everyone. But at the same time, this notion of what's been trained on, what are those pieces? I worry a little bit about an AI app that's going to write an IEP for you. And it's
Sure.
just going to write the IEP. I don't mind the framework and the speed and the structure of it. But underneath those bullets, I want to make sure that IEP is written for the student's real needs and the real challenges, not something that's just amalgamated from a few bullets that I write a prompt and I then prompt a couple times and I kind of get an IP out of this. I actually want to know what the student can and can't do, what would benefit them, and have we seen a pattern of benefit from other students like them? And that training is very, very different and very, very robust. And that's the kind of stuff that we're working on, which we can get into, is we need to go beyond just what can an LLM recall and speed up and produce.
Yep.
Granted, I'm not opposed to it. I think it's great. I think kids need to learn this stuff too. I think we need to learn how to use the right tools to put speed on the stuff that it matters less and put deeper thinking on the stuff that matters more. So I'm all for bringing these tools to market. I just don't think there's an economic long-term viable market. It's kind of pets.com-ish to some degree, but you're going to have a lot of little apps using a lot of little LLM queries and maybe even some agentic stuff built into this. I think where the future is what's the data set and what's my data set as a school district or as a school or as a teacher, and how my data set looks this year versus last year and other things. And then I'm not going to throw that out to the world, because I don't want Matt's data and Todd's data to just get, to everything be trained on for the public necessarily. I do think there's some obviously de-identification work and some work that can help and benefit the whole of education. But I'm
Standard
talking
setting.
about,
Yeah.
yeah, and obviously a standard set that can really build that. But I'm
Yeah.
talking about what impacts today's period 4 math lesson in fractions, and what data do we have about those students and those learners in the classroom, and what prerequisite skills are they missing and not missing, and what rich resources do we have to automate and expand that personalized teaching and learning environment. And I know we've moved to personalized learning in a big way, and I think Sal Khan's done a great job of coming up with some of the math kind of opportunities with one of the first products into the market. But I want to go beyond personalized learning, and I want to talk about personalized teaching and learning, because I think that's it's the harder stuff, and it's the connection to the broader educational system that we need to really be thinking about. And I think that's what companies like us and others in this space can start to provide as we get beyond just the startup phase of AI and moving this into large scaled companies like Renaissance. And so how does content rich environment, and how does this alignment conversation, which I think we should talk a little bit more about, is alignment, because that's the hardest stuff in EdTech.
I think that's exactly right. And I think Sal Khan had sort of a meteoric rise with AI. And I think right now is unfortunately in sort of the valley of despair, where a lot of people are sort of taking pot shots at him.
Mm-hmm.
I think I would take sort of a contrarian perspective of, I think what he's doing is pretty great for learning, and it gives a admittedly limited subset of users the ability to go far beyond what they might have on their own before, right? It gives them a companion to do that. And I think I want to harp on this, like, experiencing AI and consuming AI relative to trying to push a broad swath of people to create with AI, right? I think
Yes.
there is sort of a hierarchy that we need to establish. And this goes to just my own experience with the browser, right? It was basically like reading ESPN articles and playing like dumb online games. And granted, it's because I was on the younger side when the browser was coming out, but I think there's something reflective there of, I was doing an activity that I already knew how to do, right? I knew how to read a newsletter. I knew how to play video games, but I was consuming the browser in a way that was still relatively accessible. And I think, when we chatted at GSV, what I appreciated about your approach to integrating AI into your products was you're using the products that you have millions of users already consuming today.
Yep.
And you're delivering AI into it using your own data exhaust. And I'd love if you could just explicitly talk about how you're doing that. But I think it's making it in a more approachable way, get to some of the more interesting creative experiences when the time is right. But again, not to give you too much like effusive praise, but I think it's this notion of meeting teachers and students where they are, rather than assuming they can get to a different place.
Yeah, and it's connecting systems that have, let's be honest, been fairly disparate, very, very disconnected. And it's a lot of work to connect your assessment to your instruction. It is just a lot of work. Now, granted, there are systems that have been built in and of themselves and I built some of these at Edmentum when I was there, and we built especially credit recovery. I think credit recovery was an early AI model where you took mastery-based learning and you said, I'm going to give you a pretest. I'm going to test the structure of this schema, the total picture of all of the skills that I'm going to teach you in this course. I'm going to line up tutorial-based lessons and practice lessons against that pretest, and you're going to test against it. You're going to CLEP out, if you will, of half of that course maybe, because you maybe got really sick, you got mono, and you couldn't go to class for half of that time, and you needed the resources, or maybe you just missed skills and you just missed and you had gaps. And then you cycled through this mastery-based approach. You took tests, you took quizzes, you got keep going. Now, granted, fairly low level in terms of taxonomy, but an ability to structure an AI-ish type model for a student sitting for a second time through a course that they need to. And I think there are companies like Edgenuity and Edmentum and others that are doing a good job with that basic structure. But you take that structure and now you bring that into the regular mainstream EdTech side of the world, and you've got kids all over the place, and they're coming into that fourth grade fractions lesson example that I just talked about earlier. And our assessment systems have said, STAR being one of them, our main assessment system. We have FastBridge, we have STAR, we also have formative and common assessments in our DNA and School City assessments. And these four large platforms that, as you described, have 25 plus million students assessing, and we're gathering 100 billion data points a year on what students are knowing and not knowing. And now you take those big systems and you say, how do these systems connect to the instruction? And that's been the hard work. And so this idea of a skills mapping, and I don't mean to overplay this, but the human genome mapping has changed, obviously, what we think about in health and what we think about in hereditary diseases, as well as thinking about how can the medical system, and I think AI is going to do a tremendous amount of work in finding what's complex and difficult. And education is not that complex, but mapping learning and mapping the idea of a learning genome, if you will, or a what do students need to know from, at least in reading and math, from the beginning of pre-kindergarten and obviously earlier childhood as well, from listening, from watching mom and dad speak, to the human connection of speech and language into reading. It's a really interesting situation we have, and the transformation that's happening with science of reading, and we could get into all kinds of stuff like that. But the main point is there are building blocks of literacy, there are building blocks of math. Those extend. Those get more complicated on a vertical scale. They extend on a horizontal scale. They interact with each other. And the idea of the skills and standards and then higher order thinking skills and the learning that comes over the top of that. But the main point here is we've mapped at a skills level, a very granular set of skills. And we've been able to build all that out to then start to map that to instruction and curriculum. And that has honestly been the hardest work of all of this, is at what granularity. There are 50 states, plus the international standards that we have to deal with, plus the other district level scope and sequence type work that happens. So we've got about 160, 170 different alignment points in terms of what others need to see. And then we have the alignment on a specific level to granularity that might be, well, there's 3 skills in this standard, there's 2 skills in this standard, and you've got a prerequisite skill that you really need for if you look at algebra maps really interesting way of where the complex and difficult things are. And I'm belaboring this point just for a second, only because with those 100 billion data points that we're getting per year, that's informing on both on a standards basis and on a norm-based informational set, de-identified. We look at what skills do students struggle with the most. And so if you think about almost like a set of bar graphs sticking up, if every bar graph was, and now you put a person leaping over the difficult, or the bar graphs are up here and the easier things are down here, we need to spend more time on the more difficult skills to teach. And we need to spend less time on things that are easier to teach. And that seems so easy to understand. But when you look at the data set, there's a few things that really stick out. And I use measurement or fractions as great examples, certain phonics blends that are really complex. And there's some writing structures that are complex. There's algebra pieces as you introduce that, the size of geometry. But some of these pillars on height of complexity and difficulty are pretty high. And we're expecting one unit in 1 year, in one chapter or a couple chapters, to accomplish these difficult skills to teach and learn. And my point here is that has been slightly invisible to the educational system, because we basically look at it, hey, pass all the stuff at the end of the year, get an adequate yearly progress, do your assessment at the end of the year, and ensure you've got quality and capability. Well, it doesn't all fit in a year. for one. And two, some things we should be spending a lot more time on and a lot less time on some other things. And so I think the connection here is if we can build these large data systems like we've done, like companies like NWEA and Curriculum Associates have also built some systems, we need to ensure these are really mapping to the instructional capabilities and needs of our scope and sequences, of our textbooks, and of our resources, and start to bring about an AI vision that might help those more difficult to teach and learn skills, might help to reinforce there are maybe different learners on different paths. Both Matt's strengths are different than Todd's strengths, and we approach our ability set is slightly different. And I think ability assessment is a whole other thing we could be talking about here, but the basic nature of what I'm saying is the work at Renaissance has been to align the depth and breadth of a skill set in math and literacy focus all the way to, and then align that to 200 plus, almost 200 plus curricula and curricular structures, and then fit that to the content that's needed to be building that. That helps our development process, that helps alignment processes. And I think hopefully as we grow our publisher program that we just launched, we're going to connect more and more to the core instruction and start to bring assessment closer to instruction, where it's not a separate process of assessing, going away, and then coming back and instructing. And then at the end of the year going, hey, did it all work? And I know that I'm being lightweight on this. This is hard
No,
stuff in education because we as companies haven't done a good enough job of connecting assessment and instruction in an easy way. And even some of the companies I mentioned, like they're self-replicating routine. They only point to their stuff. And so if you've got a system that just assesses and instructs and you just trust it, well, how do you have a teaching system where you go, we're all teaching this unit on fractions, but you got kids all over the place. And so there's a whole other conversation about differentiated instruction, about MTSS, about tiered learners. I just crammed a lot in that and didn't let you talk, Matt. But I think the point being, there's a big effort now to align assessment and instruction, and that deep alignment is what's needed here. So it doesn't look thrown together. This looks cohesive. It looks connected, that assessment and instruction start to work together.
yeah. Well, and if you want to throw back to pets.com, around the same time we got the No Child Left Behind Act, right? And like, maybe this is controversial, but like I don't think the intent behind No Child Left Behind was bad. Like I
No.
think it's a generally good idea to want to assess how children are doing in the classroom and how we're doing as a nation educating our young people. But maybe it was a little early and we didn't really understand how to do that. And the type of integration that you're talking about just wasn't technically possible. And so we relied on, as we rely on them for so many different things, including social services and other things, our teachers to survive on intuition. And we have a lot of great teachers that can do it because they're brilliant. And but it just creates this burden on them to do so much in the classroom. And so what I like about, again, why I think it's really important to put a lens on what y'all are up to is creating these systems that allow teachers to use less intuition and more data to inform their instruction, right? And it creates a much more tangible conversation.
Yeah, and I think we've seen states like Florida get an exception to their process by building in a progress monitoring orientation to this, that we can take cuts every third of the year and see how students are doing. And that's another step of granularity. I think we could even go more granular and have more updated progress monitoring and shorter and quicker assessments to get feedback loops faster. And we can talk about that, but I think the benefit of having these type of interim progress monitoring oriented assessments do give you a better cut than the end of year test when it's too late and it's at the end of the year, and you're getting it in June and school's over.
Everyone's tired.
And then everyone's tired. And what are we gonna do? Go back and look at that stuff again? I'm in workshop days waiting to go to the beach. It's like that's a little difficult. I think it did illuminate the need for subgroups to have. And I think what unifies our country and makes us better than the other countries is we help every student get educated. And I think many of the other countries that are taking some of these TIMSS tests and other international standard tests aren't putting all their students through these same assessments. And we believe in having every student get to that ability level and see that that capability. And I love that about our country. But at the same time, I don't know that we've given those assessments early enough or often enough to make the adjustments needed. Now, I'm not a big testing person, even though I'm helping run a big testing company. We're a third of our business is assessment. That's what we do.
Yeah.
But at the same
But
time,
intentional
but
testing.
intentionally trying to accelerate learning. That's what our mission
Yeah.
is to accelerate learning. And so how do we make these connections, whether it's to our content or others, that help make those micro adjustments along the way? What we've learned in software is you can't do these big waterfall, big bang software efforts. I've been building
Right.
software for now, post my education experience, for 20 years, 25 years, sorry. And even in my first startup, you got to start with a single phoneme. My first startup was in phonemic awareness. We started with one phoneme. Let's get this phoneme right. How are we going to teach it? How are we going to ensure that students get it? What kind of experience of practice and instruction are we going to have between the teacher and the student? What's the tech going to do? What's print going to do? What's the experience going to do overall? And these micro adjustments that you got to make along the way is how you build better software. And that's what agile orientation has been. How do we help teachers become more agile? Well, I think we give them better data, because you have to have really short cycle goals and data opportunities to change and transform. And I think that's what AI actually does start to help us with, is give those reminders and those connections and be the partner to this process, because it can analyze data better than we can as humans. It can connect data and see that quickly. And that's the power of when we started we've done 13 product acquisitions, and we're putting all of the same exact data set into one store of data so that we can see that information across, obviously in a highly secured, this is very private for the individual as well as for the school and the school system. But we've done it in a way that we've been able to learn from that exhaust data across not just a big assessment like a STAR middle of the year assessment, but even a small 5-question short accelerated reader test, or a freckle example, or even monitoring how students are working with individual products like Nearpod and Vocabulary as well. And so bringing all that exhaust data into one spot, connecting that exhaust data back to that backbone of skills and experience, and then connecting more of the industry, which is what we're working on next, which I think is an exciting venture to move assessment and instruction and then the practice and support work in between that.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect way to end. And I think maybe in the fall we get into how you're spreading it across the industry. But I really, really relate to wanting to start by doing one thing really well. And I think maybe it's a little counterintuitive for a big company, right? Where we think about deploying hundreds of millions of dollars in R&D, et cetera, et cetera. But like just being true to that one thing and then growing as is allowed by the student and the experience, I think is really important.
Yeah.
And I think the way you're doing it, the way you're trying to bring assessment to instruction in a really sort of compassionate for the teacher way is something that I hope others in the industry will relate to and want to build towards themselves. I just want to say thank you for
Oh, of
spending the
course.
time and
Yeah.
for sort of examining this problem with me.
Well, thank you for bringing it up. I'm excited for the day that that educators can utilize data and really personalize teaching and learning, because I think at the heart of it, that's what improves our system, is having that right adjustable moment and change and transformations. This is what I'm going to spend my time on, and I'm glad you're talking to us about it, and I hope others do as well, because I think we can do better as an industry, and I think the exciting part is I think we're going to start to see signs of that.
It's coming. It's coming.
Yeah. Yeah. All right.
Awesome. Thanks,
Thanks,
Todd.
Matt. Trish, it's great to chat with you. Well, we may need to see each other on the ski hill or the snowboard hill here,
I
but
hope so. I
that'd
hope
be
so.
all right. Thanks, Matt.